Good afternoon, everyone. I'm mindful we still have a few folks coming through from the lobby, but it's a couple of minutes after 12, so I think it's a good idea for us to get started. Mindful, we don't have a heap of time today on what is a topic that I'm sure that we're going to have a lot of engagement with, and a lot of questions. We've got a short presentation for you today, and then we will have some time for questions at the end. So good afternoon. Welcome to the update today on the contract co-design process. I'm Lucy Carter, so I'm a partner at LEK Consulting. My colleague Jeff Forrest and I are the independent facilitators for the contract co-design process. The purpose of the session today is a progress update on the industry-led electricity contract co-design process. This is the first webinar we've held since the working group was convened in May, so we're looking forward to sharing perspectives on the work we've been doing, what's been done to date, and our plan for moving forward. The working group members are going to take you through some of what's been covered in the two workshops to date, including the current priorities, the forward plan for some of the work, and how industry can continue to provide input into the process as it develops. And we'll also have a recap from the convening group on where this work fits within the context of the broader NEM review implementation process, because we're mindful that in some of the informal industry consultation processes that have happened to date, that has been one of the questions, and it's important to just be clear on what this process is doing and how that fits into the overall process. I'm very pleased to be joined today by 4 representatives from the industry working group. We have Andrew Wilkins, do you want to give a wave if you're on camera, Andrew, and Steph Easton, who will take us through the main briefing. And we also have Ali Bonakdar and Tom Arnold, who will join us for the Q&A session at the end. We also have Mel Pang from the NEM review implementation team, who will provide us with a bit of an introduction today and some of the context of where this piece of work sits within the overall process. Before we dive into the content, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, seas and waters across Australia. We pay our respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past and present, and acknowledge First Nation peoples' deep and continuing connection to country. I'm joining today from Melbourne on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, but I'm mindful that we have people on the call from many parts of Australia. A few housekeeping notes before we get started on the content. Everyone's cameras will be off for participants. You can obviously see the presenters that we have today. And microphones will also be muted for today's session. We'll be using access through the QR code on the screen. We're putting it up now, obviously, so that you've got an opportunity to snap that QR code and start entering questions as we go through the presentation. We'll aim to get through as many of the questions as possible in the Q&A section at the end today. We're mindful that we may not have time to get through all of them. To the extent that we don't get through questions, we'll endeavour to provide written responses. Those written responses will be posted alongside the webinar upload, and also we may group some of those questions into themes if there's a number of similar questions coming through on related topics. We're aware that there's a lot of interest in the broader NEM review implementation process, so this webinar will focus on the co-design process being led by the ESEM industry working group. If we receive questions outside of the scope for that working group, we may not answer those questions in this session or may take them on notice. I suppose I put that in the information up front just because we've only got a limited amount of time and we do want to make sure that we're making best use of the time with working group members. We obviously have some folks from the convening group in the call as well. So to the extent that there are those questions, there is an opportunity to take them on notice, but we will focus questions at the end around questions related specifically to the ESEM and the co-design process for the working group. With that intro out of the way, I'd like to hand over to Mel Pang from the Australian Government's NEM review implementation team. So Mel's going to begin with an overview of the broader NEM review context and the interrelation between this process and the other work streams.
Thanks, Lucy. Hi everyone, my name is Mel Pang. I head up the NEM Review Implementation Task Force. And so we convene, I guess straight to this slide, we convene the jurisdictions as well and are working together to deliver the overall NEM Review recommendations. The biggest game in our town is definitely the ESEM. And so I'll go really quickly through this because I do think, like Lucy said, a majority of this really should be focusing on the contract co-design working group. But this is just here to situate the contract co-design working group amongst all the other work going on, implementing the ESEM and the NEM review recommendations. So we see it very much as almost quarantined with the 11 industry specialists, the convening group as well, and what you will see coming out at each of these as they happen. And of course, the outputs do feed into the other work that we do in the task force, and it's very much around developing the ledge package and amendments that will go to consultation within the next 2 months, and then supporting the process that I'm sure many of you are familiar with around getting the legislative amendment through South Australia Parliament and setting up in parallel the ESEM entities, which would include an administrator to actually deliver what ministers have asked us to deliver, which is a tender by, or at least a commencement of the scheme by Q4 2027. So we are supported a lot by the market bodies as well, who are very involved in the design process as well. We leverage them for expertise. We have a fairly senior group of jurisdiction officials meeting pretty much fortnightly, sometimes more often, sometimes for a whole day, to really get through the implementation of the policy framework that will form the ESEM. And for any of you who aren't aware of, I guess, our layers of bureaucracy that take us to the decision makers at ESEMC, that involves, so the senior collection of officials is called the Implementation Steering Committee that meets very regularly. And the level above them is the Energy and Climate Change Senior Officials Group, who then brief into ministers, which is that top row in green. I'll move to the next slide. So this is just a snapshot of our timeframes. Currently, we are hurtling towards an Energy Minister's decision to agree that we can consult on our legislative package. We're hoping to get that authority in about mid to late September. If we get that authority, we'll be looking to consult on the package in October. It'll be a relatively short consultation given our need to get Energy Ministers by December to unanimously agree the NEL amendment. And pending that, of course, and work that is happening in parallel, very much no regrets work in continuing to set up the ESEM and design how it will be rolled out operationally. So the mustard coloured row there, or track, is how the contract co-design process aligns with everything else that we're doing through the task force around finalising the legislative package and the rules package. I'll go to the next slide just to sum it up, which is the collection of all the ESEM design considerations. Of course, I'm sure there's many more than these. A lot of these are interconnected and interrelated, but certainly these are the key policy rocks or key issues that we're trying to nut out, or we are nutting out, and largely will be represented through the legislative package or the rules, or moving down from that, the guidelines. I'll stop there as the overarching context. I think I'm going to stop. I'm not going to invite questions either. I don't want to take over on what short time there is here to talk about contract co-design. But Lucy, I can stick around to the end and take any quick ones if there are any.
That'd be great, Mel. Thank you very much. I think we're passing over to Andrew for the first part of the progress update.
Thanks, Lucy. So I'm Andrew Wilkins from SA Water, and I'm part of the co-design working group. So I'll just be walking you through a little bit of information about the working group and how it's operating, and then a little bit on some of the work that we've been doing before handing over to Steph to kind of round out the work of the working group. So as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware, the working group was established following the findings of the NEM review last year. That review made a broad range of recommendations, including the establishment of two key mechanisms, the Energy Services Entry Mechanism, or ESEM, as well as a market making obligation. The review also recommended an industry working group be established to develop contracts that were capable of supporting these mechanisms for 3 different energy services: bulk energy, shaping, and firming. Now, for those of you who paid attention to that review process, you may recall that there was a pilot of the working group, which was trialled as part of the review last year. And the pilot group unanimously recommended that the industry-led co-design process be adopted as the model to develop these contracts. So following that review process in the implementation, this group was then established a few months ago, and we have 11 representatives from across the industry, representing a range of participants, buyers, sellers, and lenders. And you'll be hearing from a few of us today, as I said, myself and Steph speaking, and then a couple of others, Ali and Tom, to help answer some questions. So the working group has been tasked with designing fungible, standardised electricity contracts across each of those 3 energy services. To do that, we've had a process structured around a series of workshops supported by analysis and research in between each of the workshop sessions. We've held the first 2 workshop sessions, which have been focused on laying the foundations and considering a range of different contract options that we can take forward for more detailed assessment and analysis. The later workshops in the process are looking to leverage this analysis and industry feedback to determine a short list of preferred contract options and progress to final recommendations at the end of the year. So if we go on to, yep, there we go. So the first workshop that we had focused not just on reviewing the findings of the pilot working group, but on then forming an independent view as to whether any of these were actually appropriate for this working group to adopt. In doing that, we considered the contract design criteria used and reviewed the initial list of contract options. The working group agreed that because fungibility is a fundamental design requirement consistent with the terms of reference that the working group has been given, we didn't need to use that separately as an evaluation criteria. Bankability was a core evaluation criteria we identified. So it was previously considered in the pilot as a component of risk allocation, and the decision by this working group to separate it reflects the role of the ESEM as an entry mechanism. We also agreed that contracts that are technology agnostic are preferred, but we also identified that it may be difficult to achieve this for the bulk energy contracts, which may need to be tied to specific technologies. Finally, we identified that the set of contracts should be suitable to support large industrial loads, retailers, traders, and other customers, but noted that this does not mean the contracts must mitigate all residual risks. So then in the second workshop, a core part of that work was a detailed evaluation of the contracts and considering whether or not they could be operationalized, really emphasizing the bankability and operational considerations of the contracts. Each contract type was assessed based on the evaluation criteria that we'd previously gone through in the first workshop to determine a priority set of contracts for further detailed analysis. The objective of this exercise wasn't to formally identify final recommendations, but rather to determine which contract structures ought to be first considered. So let's go and have a look at those contract evaluation criteria. As I mentioned, bankability was a key part of the considerations for workshop 2 and determining whether or not contracts are operationally achievable. So these two criteria were ranked as the most important evaluation criteria for the assessment by the working group. And they came through so strongly because the ESEM is intended to support the delivery of new projects. So if we can't achieve those two things, we're not going to see new generation entering the market under these mechanisms. Excuse me, the working group, that means whether a contract can provide enough revenue certainty and appropriate risk allocation and a commercial foundation to support investment decisions. The other criteria on this list are also important. We're evaluating whether a contract is attractive to both buyers and sellers, simple enough to value, efficient in how it allocates risk, adaptable to future market conditions, and how well the contracts complement the broader ESEM contract suite. So together, these criteria have helped us to identify which of the contract structures should be prioritised for further analysis. So I'll take you through the first set of contracts that we've looked at, which are for bulk energy, and then hand over to Steph. So for bulk energy contracts, we looked at 3 contract structures in detail for bulk energy, noting that we have an overarching requirement for fungibility. So these 3 contract structures were the reference ex post revenue swap, the reference ex post dispatch weighted average swap, and a time of day swap. We did consider that a cap or floor mechanism may be needed across all 3 of the contract structures to reduce seller exposure and support bankability. We considered that a cap may improve bankability without materially reducing the value of the product for buyers, given buyers would likely enter into separate contracts to manage tail risk events. So there's an expected low correlation between high periods of bulk energy supply and high spot prices. The time of day swap was considered to present significant bankability challenges that would be difficult to overcome for bulk energy, and so it was deprioritized as a contract option. Of the 2 remaining contracts, the reference ex post DWA swap was assessed most favorably. It should be noted that the reference ex post revenue swap remains under consideration, but the working group did note it has additional complexities to overcome, and so it's not been assessed as favorably. So where are we going with these contracts from here? We've agreed on several areas to start further investigation. We consider that much of the analysis that we're doing for this applies both to the DWA swap and to the revenue swap, so it lets us better compare both of those models. So to test the suitability of the contracts, we're going to look at a cash flow analysis, including options for a cap or floor mechanism, undertake more detailed assessment of bankability and financing implications, examine the risk allocation for MLF, curtailment, and force majeure events, as well as appropriate mitigants, quantify the level of risk across technologies, particularly for wind and across NEM regions compared to a run-of-plant PPA, and explore risk management and insurance products that could support seller risk management, including for FM events. We consider that currently the DWA swap is the most viable of the options. However, depending on the outcomes of the assessment, we may also consider if the accounting considerations associated with the revenue swap to see if some of the issues we've identified there are problematic or not. Particularly if a revenue swap is considered a lease under accounting standards, we're concerned that this may limit its attractiveness to buyers. So on that note, I'll hand over to Steph to take you through the remaining 2 items and the rest of the presentation.
Thanks for that, Andrew. So the next service that we'll look at is the shaping service. There's been 6 different contract structures that we've been looking at for the shaping service. And based on the evaluation with that criteria that Andrew ran through, the time of day block spread, where time blocks would be nominated ahead of time, is one that's scored the most favourably. And as such, it's what we'll be prioritising as we move into the next phase of detailed analysis. And notably, this is going to focus on approaches that we could use to define nomination periods and how that might work. Looking at some of the contracts that therefore are being deprioritised, there's been some key concerns and discussions raised with fixed time blocks where they're set over the life of the contract. So this includes the peak block structures. The key reason for this is the likeliness that system demand and generation profiles change over the term of the contract. So while setting fixed time blocks is lower risk and easier to defend and hence more bankable for sellers, there is just a credible risk that we see that over time it becomes less valuable as a shaping service and hence less attractive to buyers. We also then agreed that from the perspective of both buyers and sellers, ex-post approaches to defining nomination periods wasn't optimal. So with that operational kind of lens looking at these contracts, it does pose bankability concerns to sellers and has some uncertainty to buyers. We then move to the further analysis that we're therefore doing for shaping. So firstly, we'll look to develop a cash flow model for the time of day block spread. So we understand in more detail how this could look from a bankability point of view. As I mentioned, we'll also then look at different approaches as to how to nominate the time blocks ahead of time. So with the idea being that there would be a dynamic element to those nominations, what that might look like, and whether or not an independent party would need to be a part of the operation of that type of contract to accommodate that. We'd also then want to look at whether or not there's going to be consequences of different ex-ante approaches to setting nomination blocks. So anywhere from kind of hours ahead of time, days, weeks, years ahead of time, we've discussed in the group, and really looking to dig in further as to what that could do to the way that the market operates given those different timeframes. And then with all contracts, this will be the same for bulk energy shaping and firming. We do want to understand how that relates to each other. So in particular for shaping and firming, we see that there'll be a strong relationship there for the design decisions that are made for each of those contracts. We'll then move to firming. So for firming, we were able to leverage the work that the pilot group did last year, where the cap contract was given a strong recommendation. And so this year the group has looked at a cap contract with a range of possible strike prices, so from $200 up to $5,000 as a strike price. Looking at the lower $200 price, it was considered that the strike was really below the marginal cost of a number of technologies, and so the attractiveness of defending that contract could be not so attractive to sellers and really potentially threaten bankability. Conversely, looking at where those higher strike prices are set, the attractiveness of the contract to buyers, particularly through times, was also materially reduced, and hence we really deprioritise those kind of high and low values, and we're looking to prioritise further, looking at the $300 cap and the $600 cap strike price. I think that many would be aware that this also aligns with products that we already see in the market today. So both the $300 cap being a standard contract and there being increasing liquidity for $600 cap strike prices. Worth flagging that for firming, whilst we are intending for these contracts to be technology agnostic, we did discuss broader challenges facing the delivery of gas-fired generation into the NEM. And so, to be clear, while this wasn't the working group concluding that these contract structures can't support gas-fired generation, it really was an acknowledgement that there are greater challenges facing the development of new gas-fired generation, including things like lead times and access to the supply and transportation of gas longer term. And so while we agreed it was prudent to consider whether these contracts are sufficient to incentivise investment in new gas or long duration storage capacity in and of themselves, we knew that it wouldn't be necessarily a holistic mechanism to bring gas into the system. In terms of then the further analysis we're doing for firming, once again, we'll be looking to develop those cash flow models of $300 and $600 cap contracts. And we'll then look at how those strike prices will interact with features of the market, like the market price cap and the cumulative price threshold. And then using that cash flow model, we'll look to undertake bankability assessments. That takes us to the next steps for this co-design working group. So the phase that we're currently in, that the working group are working to, will look to deliver final contract recommendations in the form of term sheets for each of the contracts that are being proposed under each of the services. That means that for us, the immediate next steps are really about testing these structures that we've prioritised and digging into more detail about the design of each of these. As has kind of been highlighted for each type of service, there's a big focus on doing bankability assessments, considering risk allocation, and looking to get feedback from industry about whether or not each of these contracts are going to perform as intended. Important for us to emphasise that this is really a progress update of where we're at and what our immediate focus is going forward, as opposed to necessarily indicating what the final recommendation is going to look like at this stage. And so as our final kind of update, the feedback that we've received from industry and from different industry forums has been really, really beneficial to date in this process. All the members of the working group are in contact with our respective peak industry bodies, and this is one of the key methods that we're using for seeking feedback from industry as part of this process. If at any stage of the process you do want to provide feedback, we really encourage you to reach out to your industry association and share it. And we'll also continue to provide these briefings from the form in this form as we progress through the work. And that feedback is only getting more important as we continue to go through this process, and we continue to conduct analysis and further detailed design and look at further considerations of each of these different contract structures. Thank you, and I'll hand back over to Lucy for the Q&A.
Thanks, Steph. So that concludes the presentation. We're now going to move into some questions. A reminder that we are using Slido as the tool for collating questions. So please use the QR code in the corner. We'll cover off some key questions on key themes. And as I mentioned at the start, if we don't have time to answer all the questions that are being posed, there'll be some responses uploaded alongside the webinar. We'll kick off. There's a question from Marilyn from Squadron Energy. And perhaps if we move this for Steph, or actually, no, question on bankability, Ali, we might get you involved for this one. So great to hear that we'll test the bankability of proposed contracts for the 3 services, bulk, shaping and firming. Who will you commission to do so? How will you ensure it's a real world test, i.e. speak to bankers and check if they would bank those contracts themselves, not just consultants' work?
Okay, thanks, Lucy, and thanks, Marilyn, very much for your question. I think you hit on the head. One of the things that came out following the pilot of last year was having a separate evaluation criteria for bankability. And as part of the 3 working groups that we had, the various members effectively rated these evaluation criteria, and bankability and operationalisation were top of mind. I think that's within the context of the foundation requirement being fungibility. So you rightly point out there will be a fair bit of work. So the working group has effectively gone through and prioritised where we want to do further deep dive in certain contract structures. And as part of that, there will be quite a detailed cash flow analysis. There'll be assessment of bankability and risks associated, how these will differ to what the market has been traditionally seeing. Assessing, as part of that, the level of risk that arises across technologies, particularly wind, across different regions, and comparing that to run of plant. So there'll be a fair bit of work that will come through that. And the second tier order will be, well, how is it, you'll be asking MLF risk, curtailment risk, force majeure risk, all dealt with. That will be a part of work that will be done. I can't actually say who the consultant will be, but it will be done in a manner that, that there will be validation, third-party validation in relation to that. In terms of engagement, Nick and I will be leading from a bankability perspective, but also will be engaging with industry peaks such as CEC and and then there'll be ample opportunity to seek feedback through those industry peak bodies as well throughout this journey.
Good. Thank you, Ali. Next question, I think, is one that we can throw to you, Steph. Do you have any thoughts on how the reference index for the DWA swap is going to work?
To date, I think the group has discussed a few different options for this, and I think out of the panel and the pilot group last year, it really was looking at regional technology grouping. But in terms of where the group is at this year, there's been analysis that's come out of the pilot last year and also being conducted by DQ and ASL this year, looking at potential options, but it really is part of the detailed design that the group will be moving into next. So whilst this has been looked at theoretical and kind of some principle-based levels, actually understanding mechanics and how that can impact the cash flow of specific projects, what that can look like operating within the system really is the next focus of the group, and something that hasn't been looked into in detail yet. However, I definitely can confirm that it has been raised as a key focus for the group. It's time and time again as we talk to it, we appreciate that that is an important variable for DWA-based contracts that have a reference. And so, yes, it definitely will be a focus of the analysis that comes out of the next stage of the group.
Very good. Maybe sticking with you, Steph, I'm mindful that the questions are bumping around, but while we've got you, there's a particular question around gas generation. Can you please go into a bit more detail on your comments about the challenges for gas generation?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was really to flag that this had been a discussion and a conversation in the second working group session that we had, that when talking about firming generation and this really being an entry mechanism, there was quite a healthy conversation in the room about whether or not these contracts would be sufficient to bring new gas generation into the system. And just to be clear, the purpose of that conversation, and that conversation occurred, is something that we think is a useful update. But the conclusion of that conversation was we're comfortable that the contracts that we're considering, so $600 caps, are viable contracts for gas generation to sell. And we also acknowledge that there's other barriers to invest in new gas generation today, and that this wasn't an incompatible contract structure, but that it potentially wasn't the complete contract structure that may be required for a gas generator. And that was, I think, kind of the key conclusion of the discussion there. In terms of the details of what was being flagged, of what are the other challenges, I mentioned, so the, I guess, supply chain, so time to get GTs and the timeline on ordering GTs that has blown out in recent years. And then the other one was the certainty of a gas supply, both from a price and a transportation. And while one might have a time element to it, the other one will feed into the bankability of that asset and the certainty of its cost model through time. So the conclusion is that really is the conversation that the group had, but the conclusion was that the firming contracts that were being looked at were still compatible with new gas turbine and long duration storage investment as attractive contracts. But for gas turbine, we acknowledge that there would probably be other factors required for the asset to be bankable.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, and I mean, also just noting there that there wasn't a firm view in that conversation around it being targeted at a particular technology, and the main requirement there was around being able to defend an extended period of an outage, rather than the working group making any particular assumptions about that being gas or otherwise at this point in the process. The next question we have is around the time of day block spread shaping product. And Tom, this is probably a good opportunity to bring you into the conversation. So who will be making the nominations during the term of the contract while it is held by the ESEM administrator? Will it be the ESEM administrator?
Thanks, Lucy. So in terms of the nominations, this is very much still at concept stage at the moment, but the idea is that the block nominations would be essentially dynamic based on market needs, and they would follow essentially a predetermined methodology. It would be essentially different each day depending on the market conditions and looking at where the contiguous blocks would best fit to complement both NEM demand and the bulk energy products. So there are a few different ways that this may be able to be done through pre-dispatch. And yeah, that's another piece of work that is going to be part of the next stage in terms of determining what the best metrics are for placing those blocks each day. It was probably the consensus of the group that ex-ante nominations are better than ex-post. But again, complementing the bulk energy is probably the key part of those nominations.
Good. Thank you. Next question we have up is about firming contracts. And Steph, this is possibly also one for you. So if the firming contracts are focused on a cap at the level of the administered price cap, how does this incentivise the continued operation of firming resources during an administered pricing period or a market suspension period where the market suspension pricing schedule applies?
Once again, it's probably, we've flagged that this is a key area of our focus as we move into detailed design. And all I'd say is that this now isn't a new conversation or a new concept. This was a challenge in 2022 in the market of the interaction between these different pricing levels that exist in the market and in the standard $300 cap market that we have today. And that there is a broader governance and set of rule requirements to ensure that supply can continue to meet demand in the grid. So it will be consideration as we move into more detailed design, but whilst it will be one consideration, we also do need to consider the effective of those contracts working within a suite of contracts and much more on a day-to-day basis as well. So it's a key consideration that we'll look at, but there's more governance than just what these contracts are to ensure that supply is sufficient to meet demand at all times of day is probably the starting point for consideration. So it will be considered, but there are other means in the market to ensure that generation continues to operate if we're in a suspended period.
Good, thank you. A question from Thomas M. So on the time of day block spread for shaping, Andrew, this is possibly one for you. How can this be transacted and valued if the structure is undefined until blocks are nominated at a third party's discretion? So maybe okay if nominations are at 2 to 3 years. Do you think this could really be traded if nominations are shorter, e.g. day ahead?
Thanks, Lucy. Look, I think this probably goes a little bit to what Tom was saying, and I do apologise that some of the answers to these questions are we're still looking into these. These are exactly the kinds of questions that the working group is currently exploring. Where we believe these types of contracts are likely to land if we can get them to work is, as Tom was kind of highlighting, a rules-based mechanism for determining what the nomination is, rather than any entity stepping in and saying charging and discharging will occur in these windows. Now, the intent and I guess some of the preliminary analysis we've done is that we believe that it's plausible that we can define or that a set of rules can be defined that will give the market confidence that when those blocks are charging and discharging are periods where you have minimum price in the market and maximum price in the market. And so really one of the big pieces of work that we're looking to do is to establish that we can define a set of rules that would achieve that outcome and that the market has confidence in that correlation. Do we expect it to be absolutely perfect? Well, no, that would probably have you heading down the ex-post side of the world, but then you get into the operational issues of how do you defend a contract when it's defined on an ex-post basis? So we think this is probably a something that's worth exploring to see if we can find a workable contract structure that will deliver exactly what you've asked about there, in terms of people having confidence that it's going to deliver on the right timeframes, that you can actually bank on that contract whilst at the same time moving as the market moves.
Very good. Thank you, Andrew. I'm mindful that we're getting relatively close to time, but we're moving at a good pace, and so I think we've possibly got time for one more. Tom, I think this is one for you. So the question is from Sydney CEIG, wondering if consideration has been given to using different contract structures for wind, solar, bulk energy.
Thanks, Lucy. I'm not sure exactly the purpose of the question, but if it's, I guess, whether a different contract would be suitable for wind and solar as separate technologies. There's a comment, I think, in the slide pack that there's a preference for technology agnostic contracts. In reality, I think the working group is looking at contracts that are specific to wind and solar as separately defined contracts. I think the path that we're heading down is certainly towards having the methodology for defining those bulk energy contracts as being the same across the board, but essentially the reference index for either a DWA swap or a revenue swap being different for solar in each region and wind in each region.
I think, Tom, it's probably worth adding that, yeah, it's certainly part of the further diligence, the quantification of level of risk across different technologies, across different NEM regions is something that is contemplated. So that's certainly consideration for the working group.
Very good. We are at time for the session today, so apologies that we haven't been able to get to all of the Q&A sessions. As I flagged at the start, we will provide written responses to the questions that haven't been addressed in this session. Thank you to everyone for attending today. Maybe a reminder on this overall process that we are sort of closer to the start of this process to the end. We had the first workshops in May, and this process will be running through to the end of the year around the working group process. There are multiple channels available for engagement. I know working group members have been having lots of conversations. We're endeavouring to make consultation with industry as sort of transparent as possible through this process. It's been a real key feature of the NEM review process. We're keen to keep that moving. A big point of consultation and an area that a lot of consultation has been happening through our peak industry bodies. So please, that's a very helpful channel if you have contacts there, or reach out through the NEM review website, email address, or through other channels within the industry. Thank you all. We'll keep to time, so I'll wrap up there. Really appreciate your engagement and looking forward to having more conversations with many of you on the call as the process proceeds.